And now I want to introduce Sandy McHenry, who will be introducing our speakers.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Tonight we welcome Mr. Jeff LaHurd and the Honorable Charles E. Williams to share with us the effects of racism in Sarasota County, both past and present. Judge Williams was raised in St. Petersburg, and as a Florida attorney and judge, he has contributed significantly to the community. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors. Judge Williams currently serves as Chief Judge for the 12th Judicial Circuit. Additionally, he is a documentary filmmaker whose films have received rewards and appeared in film festivals nationwide. He is a member of the Board of Directors of Embracing Our Differences, whose mission is to use the transformative power of arts to educate and inspire to create a better world. He is a founding member of the Sarasota County Bar Association's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which partners with the Booker High School Law Academy to encourage, support, and provide financial assistance to students seeking a career in the field of law. Jeff LaHurd, local historian and author, has lived in Sarasota since 1950 and has written 17 books and numerous articles about the history of the community. He authored a video script, Sarasota, Landmarks of the Past, which won the award for Outstanding Contribution to Preservation from the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. Mr. LaHurd retired from his position as the History Specialist for Sarasota County in 2015. He is currently on the board of the Sarasota Historical Society. Mr. LaHurd has received many rewards and honors for his work in historic preservation, including the first Hero of History Award from the Historical Society of Sarasota County. We warmly welcome these distinguished speakers and look forward to a significant learning experience. Thank you, gentlemen.
When I was a kid growing up in Sarasota, I always wanted to be a priest. This is as close as I'm ever going to get. My family moved to Sarasota in the 1950s, and it was truly an idyllic place to grow up in. We were the circus city after all. It was not overdeveloped as it is today. Everybody seemed to know everybody else. There was all kind of arts and cultural activities to do even in those days. And my first book about Sarasota was called Quintessential Sarasota, and it was more of a nostalgic look at this beautiful place that I grew up in. But the more I got into the history of Sarasota, the more I realized that it wasn't such an idyllic place if you were an African American. I went to St. Martha's School, I went to Carter Mooney's high school. I never went with a black student. I went to Manatee Junior College, no black students there while I was in school. If I went out in the evening, went to the movies, I never sat with a black person or a Mexican person or a Vietnamese person or anybody but except the type of person that I was, a middle-class kid growing up in Sarasota. So when I see these Make America Great Again hats, I'm wondering, what America are they talking about? I mean, you have to really look through American history with rose-colored glasses or not understand our history at all. Because I think when they talk about the again part, when was that? Was that back in the pre-civil rights days? Was it back before blacks could attend theaters? Was it back when white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men ruled everything? When women were expected to stay at home? Was it back during World War II when they rounded up Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps? You know, was it back when the Italians and the Irish came and they would have a sign, no dogs, no Irish, no dogs, no Italians? Is that what they want to go back to? Do they want to go back to when we put Indians on reservations where they still are today? So when I see that, my thinking is it should say, make America great. and start from there and move forward. What I plan to show you this evening is some of the history of the African American community in Sarasota, which for me was the good old days, and for many of them, they were the bad old days. Now, these are among the first black people that came to Sarasota. That's Irene and Lewis Colson. And Lewis came with the Florida Mortgage and Investment Company survey crew to plat Sarasota. And he was the one that pounded the stake in the center of 5 Points and platted the town from that point. And Irene became a midwife to Sarasota's black citizens. And they were both very instrumental in the growth of their community. Now, this is Jeffrey Bolden, and he has a very interesting story. He was a slave in North Carolina, and he escaped the slaveholder there and came down to Florida, hoping to get in with the Seminole Indians in the Everglades. Well, he wasn't up to the rigors of that and fell deathly ill among the palmetto scrub in Manatee. And he was rescued by Sarasota's first settler, William Whitaker. And he was brought to the William Whitaker home, and Mary Whitaker, his wife, nursed Jeffrey back to health again and made arrangements with the person in North Carolina to buy him for $1,000. So they bought him, brought him into their home, bought 2 other slaves, one of whom Jeffrey married. And then at the end of the Civil War, when they were freed, Jeffrey Bolden just stayed on as part of the Whitaker household. And sometime after his death, Whitaker's great grandson came and tried to find out where Jeffrey was buried, and did, and put a plaque on his gravestone that said, Jeffrey Bolden, slave, freedman, friend. Now, this is John Hamilton Gillespie standing there, and his wife is in the carriage there, and the gentleman driving is Leonard Reed. And he came to Sarasota about 1900. He had graduated from high school as a valedictorian in his class. And he came down to Sarasota, and then I think he was going to make his way to Cuba and become involved in the fishing industry, but didn't and stayed. And he became John Hamilton Gillespie's right-hand man, and a close personal friend, actually. And when Gillespie laid out the first golf course in Florida, he went with him and helped him lay out the course. And this is after he died. This is how he was described. Leonard Reed. He was tall, light of step, and carried himself with the dignity of a Scottish chieftain. What that fine, respected man left in Sarasota, his passing was a loss to the community. So that's them on the first golf course in Sarasota, about 1905. Now this is Bertha Palmer, and she was the first person to cast the international spotlight on Sarasota. She was very well known in Chicago and throughout the world for that matter, and everything she did was printed up in the national and international papers. And when she declared that Sarasota Bay was more beautiful than the Bay of Naples, it generated a lot of interest and set up what I would call the Chicago connection to Sarasota. Well, she bought a lot of property in the area, over 50,000 acres, and hired a lot of workers to help her with the acreage, the cattle, farming, whatever. Well, sometimes, some evenings, these night riders would come along and roust her black helpers. And she raised hell with the community, saying that if they didn't do something about it, they were going to lose a lot of business from her. And so so they did. They calmed them down. But there's kind of a funny story about Bertha that I like to tell. She was fabulously wealthy because her husband, Potter Palmer, owned a big mercantile business in Chicago, big property owner. And Bertha was a lot younger than he was. So I think Potter was 25 years older than she. And so Potter was meeting with his attorney to go over his will, and he was going to leave everything to Bertha. And the attorney said, well, you know, Potter, she's a lot younger than you are. She's a beautiful woman, and the chances are she's going to marry somebody else. And Potter said to him, well, he's going to need the money. Well, this is Payne Chapel. I think this is about 1905, and it was kind of the social, not only the religious, but the social scene for a lot of the African American cultural endeavors and social endeavors. And the building is actually still standing there today. I think now it's an architect's office, but at least it's still there. Now this is Henry Clifford Webb. I don't know if any of you have heard of Henry Clifford Webb, but he was an African-American inventor. And he invented this plow that would plow up palmettos. And when the state was trying to put roads in to allow more people to come in, they bought a lot of his plows. And it was said that his plow would take 6 men with axes all day, 6 days in a row, to do what one of his plows could do in 6 hours. So he became very wealthy, and this is a picture of his plow. That's it. And when they built the road between Sarasota and Venice, which they loosely called the Velvet Highway, they used this plow to dig up the palmetto scrub. This is 5 Points, and this is from where you see Sarasota's first roundabout. This is where the community of Sarasota was first platted. And the reason I have this up there, this is right after World War I, and you see a welcoming parade for the servicemen who served in the Great War. But there are no black soldiers in the parade. I mean, even during wartime, everything was segregated. It wasn't until Harry S. Truman became president that he desegregated the military. So when the boys were leaving for World War I, and they had a big community gathering for them at the Ritz Theater, and they had a big send-off for them at the Seymour Airline Railway Station, there were no black people in attendance. They went individually whenever they were called up, I guess. Now, this is a letterhead for the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, the Sarasota edition. And they were really quite a presence in Sarasota. And they put on, they put on this Klan circus in Sarasota about 1925, I think. And preceding the circus, they had a giant Klan rally. There must have been 300 people marching down Main Street with their hoods on, and one guy on a horse carrying a banner or something. And then this is another. And their motto was, no right-thinking American would have any problem belonging to the Ku Klux Klan. Now this, right after the Klan parade and the Klan circus, this was at the Sarasota Herald, doing nothing but at cost. Sarasota Negroes find they are not lilies of the field. And what this was about was some businessmen went to the sheriff and said, we can't get any workers. So from that point, the sheriffs and the police department would walk around, and if they saw black person standing on the corner or a black person in the pool hall or wherever, they could charge them with idleness. And then they would give them the choice of either on the work gang or paying a fine, which they couldn't afford to pay, so they got on the work gang. Now, right after that, this is the Sarasota Sheriff's Department. Yeah. This is before exercise became all the rage. But right after that, a black person was standing on the corner and walking down the street, and one of these deputies came up to him and said, "How come you're not working?" And the black citizen said, well, he didn't think that was any of his business. At which point the deputy took out a pistol and pistol whipped him. And it caused great consternation in the rest of the community. And they doctored him up. I never learned what became of the deputy. My thinking is not much given the era that it happened in. Now this is Laurel Colored School. You know, this is an example, I guess, of separate but equal. And as you can see, it's certainly separate, but nothing to do with equality. Now, this is where I went to high school, Sarasota High School. It's where I ended up. I went to St. Martha's. That was an 8-year program. It took me 9 years to get out of it. And then I went to Carnegie, and that was a 4-year program, but they asked me to leave after 3. So anyways, I ended up over here my senior year and finally managed to get out. But there were no black students there. I graduated in '64. I think there was one black girl in the whole school. Her name was Wilhelmina. And then this is the Rosenwald School. This is where some of the black kids went to school. And during their 20s and such, the school superintendent didn't think a black person needed an education beyond the 8th grade. Now the lady on the left is Emma Booker. And she's the lady for whom all the Booker schools are named. And she was really a saint to the black community. You know, as I said, if a black person wanted an education beyond the 8th grade, they had to get it someplace else. And Emma Booker would often help that person financially go to Tampa or go to Fort Myers to complete their education. And she really understood the importance of education for everybody. And she worked part-time on her own bachelor's degree for 20 years before she finally got it. And this is this is Booker Middle School class. And this is the first class. I think the first high school class graduated from Booker in 1935. And there were 4 black students that graduated at that time. And I thought that was interesting because the first white high school, the Sarasota, had graduated 4 seniors at one time. Now this is the Colson Hotel. It was named for Lewis Colson, and it was built in 1925 by Owen Burns' brother, I.O. Burns. And it cost $35,000. It had 28 rooms, a soda pop parlor, and a sanitary barber shop. So this is 1935. You can see there's no black attorneys. There's one woman attorney there. I don't know how she got into the mix. And then this is 1953. No black attorneys. And then this is the Sarasota Police Department. This is probably 53 or so, no black officers. Fire Department, all white. Now this is the Civilian Conservation Corps from the Depression era, the 30s. And Sarasota had the only black contingent in Florida. And they did all of that work in Mayaca. And some of their edifices still stand, some of the cabins, some of the bridges. Did you see those rattlesnakes they're holding up? They used to kill those and cut them up and use them for dinners. I've never had that.
Literally tastes like chicken.
Doesn't everything taste like chicken? I got two fish that taste like chicken. Now, during World War II, Sarasota and Venice both were training bases. Sarasota had 3,500 trainees, and I think Venice had 3,900 trainees. And when I look at this picture, my first thought was, that poor lady's looking for a husband for her baby. But maybe not. That's just me. So this is the Army-Navy Club for the white troops. Everything, as I said, was still segregated in the Army and every place else for that matter. And this is the club for the black soldier trainees, which became the Newtown Recreation Center. Now this is at the corner in Sarasota of Main and Orange. It's where Michael Saunders' offices are today, that tall building. And this was a bus terminal, either for Greyhound or Trailways, I think. But when it was open, a big deal was made out of the fact that they had separate quarters or separate dining areas for black patrons as well as white. And then this is the waiting room. And then, of course, the white and the colored, quote-unquote, mountains. There was a story I heard. There was a coffee shop in downtown Sarasota called Johnny's Coffee Shop, and a bunch of the boys were gathered around drinking coffee around the tables, and the African-American chef came out, and he was standing there with them, and everybody was talking and happy, and then blah, blah, blah. So then the chef just sat down among them, and then all of a sudden it was like you could hear a pin drop. You know, it was like he overstepped his bounds. Now this is J.H. Floyd, and he came to Sarasota in 1925, and he was a contractor. He became a very successful one. He built a lot of homes in the Newtown area, and in 1960 he opened up the Sarasota Welfare Home, and he was another, you know, proud member of the community, somebody who was helping his people move forward, is a word. Now this is the Bradenton Devil Nines baseball team, and they were part of the Florida State Negro League, and they were really good. They were among the best teams in the league that year. I think this is 1937 or so. Now this is Buck O'Neill. And he was really, everything I've read about him, I never got to meet him, but everything I read about him, he was just a real gentleman. And he was a Class A player in both the Negro League and then later in the majors. And he was also a scout in the major leagues and a coach. But I jotted down a couple things. He just narrowly missed being into the Baseball Hall of Fame because of a time thing. It timed out, so he couldn't get in. So this is what he said about that. Don't shed any tears. You think about this. Here I am, the grandson of a slave, and here the whole world was excited about whether I was going into the Hall of Fame or not. We've come a long ways. And then somebody said of him, he was wonderful and kind. He was wonderful and kind, always insisting on gentlemanly behavior and a good suit. And this is him. He couldn't get a diploma from Sarasota High School, but this is an honorary diploma that they gave him. He was just a sweet man. Now, You know, baseball wasn't integrated until 1947 when Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers. So when teams traveled, they didn't have to worry about segregation in the South because there were no black players anyway. But after that, after the league was integrated with Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby, when they traveled, when they got to the South, they couldn't stay with the team because they couldn't stay in the hotels or the motels or whatever. So they had to put them up in private homes. And then when Arthur Allen bought the Chicago White Sox and moved them to Sarasota for spring training, he bought the Sarasota Terrace Hotel. And so all his baseball players could stay in one place together. Now this is the Ace Theater. I don't know who the gentleman leaning against Pontiac is. I'm thinking this is about 1953 or so. And the Ace Theater was the Black Theater in Sarasota. And the building is still there. It's off of Central Avenue. I think it's a French restaurant now, but at least the building is still there. Now this was a seminal event in Sarasota city history. This is the swearing in of Ken Thompson, who was city manager in Sarasota for 38 years. And this is the lunch counter in 1961. You know, during the late 50s, early 60s, blacks were going to lunch counters at state sit-ins, and this one was at Ringling Shopping Center. And the person who came in there brought 14 of his friends just to sit in, knowing that they wouldn't be served, but to make their protest. And then when he left, he said, I could have brought 40 people here with me today and another 200 outside, but I didn't want to cause any problems. I just wanted to make a statement. Now back to Ken Thompson. When he first came to Sarasota, the golf course and the library were segregated. And Ed James, Dr. Ed James, who was a black activist, went to the library, the Tuskegee Library, which is this, and said, I want to check out a book. He had 3 or 4 of his friends with him. And the librarian said, I'm sorry, you can't check out a book, you know the rules. So Ed James said, well, I want to speak to your boss. So she got Ken Thompson on the phone. And Ken Thompson invited him down to City Hall. And 4 of them went down there to visit with Ken Thompson. The 5th one didn't because he was afraid they were going to be arrested when they got there. So anyways, they talked to Ken Thompson and told him the background and said they wanted to start checking out books at the Tuskegee Library. And Ken Thompson picked up the phone and called up the librarian and said, from now on, anytime anybody wants to rent a book, whether they're white or black, we lend them the book. And from that point, the library was segregated. Sorry, integrated. Now the same with the golf course. You know, the only black people that could play golf there were the caddies. So a couple of them picked up the phone and called Ken Thompson and said, we want to bring a party and play golf there. So Ken Thompson said, well, it's a municipal court. You got the right to play there if you want. And he picked up the phone and called the manager of the golf course and said, from now on, anybody can play golf there.
What year was that?
I would say that's approximately 1958, in that era. A lot of the communities were selling their golf courses rather than integrate them. Same with their beaches and such. A lot of places were selling their beaches or beachfront property rather than integrate. Now, Sarasota wanted to find a black beach for the African American citizens to swim at. It was a hot potato. You know, they wanted to put a place on Siesta Key that didn't fly. They wanted to put a place on Longboat Key. That was shot out of the sky. They had a place in Venice that they could swim at. But can you imagine getting from Newtown to Venice? You know, that was crazy. So anyways, a group of them went to the beach. It says 100 Negroes visit Lido Beach. And there was no disturbance, but obviously it made the paper and people were worried it was going to screw up our economy on the beach and everything. So this is an editorial in the news, and they were saying that there were just a few radical black people that wanted to swim with white people in area beaches, and a lot of hotheads are trying to stir up the pot. And that this Negro beach site is proposed on Longboat. You can imagine how that went over on Longboat. I can't even get on Longboat today. So anyways, the Longboat Key citizens got together and voted to incorporate as a municipality so that they could prevent blacks swimming there, and that's why Longboat became a town. Now this picture of William McKinley Canner, he was a Pulitzer Prize winning author, well known in Sarasota and throughout the country for that matter. His Pulitzer Prize was for Andersonville. And he wrote a letter to the commissioners calling them cowards and saying if they didn't find a solution to the black beach problem, he was going to write an article for a national publication saying that Sarasota cheats its children. So they scurried around, and they came up with this idea to build a pool at the Newtown Recreational Center. Now, at this time, you have to remember, some of the black people didn't want to swim with the white people. You know, they just wanted their own place to go to. And others of them wanted to integrate the beaches to further integration in all the aspects of Sarasota life. So there was a little schism there in the beginning. Now this is the Lido Casino on Lido Key. And this was opened in 1940 and it remained there until 1969 when it was demolished. But no blacks were allowed to go there. You know, and Dred Atkins, who became a mayor of Sarasota, I believe either he or Dupree were the first black mayors, said he heard a lot of talk about Lido Beach and Lido Casino and what a pretty place it was, but he never saw it, which I thought was really a poignant, sad thing about what a lot of black people never had access to while I was growing up in Sarasota. And, you know, if you go downtown in Sarasota today, you don't see very many black people. Black people do not wait on you that much once in a while. You know, very few black people on the beach. I go to the beach every day, and I very seldom see a black person. When I do, I assume they're from out of town. If you go to St. Armand's Circle, you very seldom see black families there. So I don't really think that Sarasota is integrated in the real sense of the word. You know, there's been a lot of inroads. We've had a black chief of police. We've got black police officers, black detectives. We have an African-American judge, the first one in Sarasota. But up until that point, and even today, you could not convince me that Sarasota is segregated. So with that, I'll say thank you for having me here tonight. And Dominus Vobiscum.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me okay? Yeah. Testing, 1, 2, 3. I'm not having power, but I may actually ask Jeff to help me in some of this. My my version of what Jeff has said is basically I'm fast forwarding from the history lesson. Let me just give you a brief introduction. I was born in a small town in North Carolina called Bolden, North Carolina. If you're driving I-95 north, it's the second to last exit before you get into Virginia. That's how we find it. It's always been under 2,000 people. Right now, I think the population is about 1,500, but I grew up basically in St. Petersburg. My family left North Carolina when I was about 3 years old. There was a very active Klan in Bolden, North Carolina, and although I was too young to remember, the Klan was very much a part of the reason that my family actually left North Carolina. Unlike others who migrated north, we migrated south and ended up in St. Petersburg, Florida, where I grew up. I only left the state for 4 years when I went to undergraduate school at Howard University in Washington, D.C., but I have lived in the South all but those 4 years. So from a historical point of view, I'm here to try to put in a little bit of perspective of where we are now in Sarasota, and then I think we'll open it up to some questions. When I talk to people, and especially when I talk to students, I always like to talk to people in a legal history perspective. Obviously, I'm a lawyer. I was a lawyer before I was a judge. I've been a judge 20 years now, which means I'm a judge longer than I was a lawyer, which is kind of weird. But I love the law and I love history. I came to know Jeff because one of the first things that I did was study about the history of Sarasota when I was actually doing research on a film, a documentary film that we did that I'll talk about in a moment. But I always start my lectures about segregation and integration with 3 U.S. Supreme Court cases that I hope all of you know about. The first one is the Dred Scott decision. How many know about the Dred Scott decision? That's where we start. That's the starting point. The Dred Scott decision was a decision that basically defined who we were as African Americans. Dred Scott was a runaway slave. Dred Scott sued for his freedom. The issue in front of the Supreme Court at that point was whether or not Dred Scott had any rights under the Constitution. That's the Cliff Notes version. The Supreme Court basically said no. That an African American was basically not given the protection of the Constitution and was not a citizen and had no rights that a white man had to recognize. And that was the law of the land. Ultimately, the Dred Scott decision led to the Civil War. Fast forward. Then we have a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Does everyone know about Plessy versus Ferguson? Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that was decided in New Orleans, my favorite city, in which Homer Plessy got on a streetcar that was segregated to test the laws of the South in terms of segregation. He was arrested, he was given a fine, went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that separate facilities were a constitution, and that was the law of the land. So all of the black and white water fountains you see, all of the segregated beaches really are vestiges of the Plessy versus Ferguson's decision. And then we came to the famous decision of Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure everybody knows about. And that's where I want to pick up the history of Sarasota and Manatee County. All right, I want to make sure. Can you hear me okay? We're good? Okay. So you read about a little bit about my bio. I did a documentary film. The film was about the integration of Lincoln Memorial High School. The name of the film was Through the Tunnel. The title isn't necessarily important, but the idea was we wanted to do a film that talked about the integration of the Manatee County schools. Lincoln Memorial High School was the black school. If you were interested in going to high school in Manatee County, that was it. Okay? So you had to go to Lincoln. Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954. There was a clause in the Brown decision that said, with all deliberate speed. And we all know what that meant, right? As slow as possible. So even though Brown argued argued for the fact that schools needed to be integrated, that separate schools were unconstitutional per se. In the late 1950s, early 1960s in Sarasota and Manatee County, we still had segregated schools. And so I want to pick up from there because that's where I became really interested in the history of Sarasota and Manatee. In Manatee County, as of 1967, they had not integrated their schools. Okay? There was a governor, those of you who have lived here long enough, there was a governor by the name of Clifford. Clifford was sort of the Donald Trump of his era. And he had a very famous, everybody recognizes the George Wallace scene at the University of Alabama where he stands in the door. Well, Governor Kirk had that same type of photo op in Manatee County, in which he stood in front of the Manatee County School Board and said that we were not going to integrate the schools in Manatee County until Manatee County was ready. That's about what it was. There was a federal judge by the name of Plessy in Tampa who said, okay, that's fine, Governor Kirk, if you want to stand in front of the school board and prevent the integration of Manatee County schools, I'm going to fine you $10,000 a day in 1967 money. Here's the twist. He fined the governor personally, meaning that you can't use state funds, it's your money that's going to be assessed at $10,000 a day. You can guess what happened. The next day, Governor Kirk leaves, schools are integrated. But what that meant in practical terms was Manatee High School was closed because obviously they were not going to have white students go to Lincoln Memorial High School was going to be closed. They were not going to have white students go to Lincoln Memorial High School, so they closed it. And they made all of those students at Lincoln Memorial go to Manatee High School and Palmetto High School, and I don't think Southeast was up at that time. Sarasota had a different history. Booker High School, you saw the picture of Emma Booker. Booker High School was in the same position. But Booker refused to close. And there's a whole chapter of what happened during that era. That Booker refused to close. Some students did voluntarily go to Sarasota High School, but Booker's students' parents wanted their school to stay open. And so they basically started freedom schools. And they boycotted sending their students to white schools, and they wanted to keep Booker open. Ultimately, Booker remained open, and Booker is there still today. In fact, Booker High School is one of the most outstanding schools in Sarasota. They have a world-class visual and performing arts program. So, fast forward, we're still now dealing with Brown versus Board of Education. So, we are supposedly at a point in our history where integration is the rule of law, right? Segregated schools, segregated facilities, all of that's in the past. So let's fast forward again to now. And that's why I wanted to sort of put things in perspective a little bit. I cannot speak for what's going on in Venice, and there are people who are unsure. If I don't know you're an African American, that means you must either live in Venice or you must have gotten down there. So I try to get out and know everyone. But I don't know the law, I don't know the history so much of Venice, so I'm going to give you the history of where we are in Sarasota. In 1998, I was appointed the first African-American judge to serve in the 12th Judicial Circuit. That means I'm the only African-American male judge to this day. And that was 1998. I've been a judge now 20 years. We have an African-American female judge, and that's it. There still is a perception for those who come to Sarasota. The question that I get often is, where are all the black people, right? You go downtown in Sarasota, you go to the theaters in Sarasota, you go to the movies in Sarasota, and there still is some trepidation of African Americans being incorporated into the citizenry of Sarasota. And I'm always perplexed by that. And I've always been asked that question, well, where are they? There's some things that are going on in Sarasota that I think are vestiges of segregation still. And one of the things that I'm very concerned about, and it's something that is very real, is the gentrification of the Newtown community. So those of you who aren't familiar with the city of Sarasota, the Newtown community is really sort of downtown. It's not in the center of downtown. It's sort of north of downtown. But there is certainly some sort of gentrification that's going on there. Many of the slides that you saw, that whole area now has been converted. It used to be called the Overtown area when African Americans lived there. Now it's called the Rosemary District. And now it is a home to million-dollar high-rises, high-skilled shops, high-end restaurants, and the vestiges of the African American community that used to live there now is really relegated to basically signs. There's a sign where the Ace Theater was. There's a sign where, this was the first African American community in Sarasota. But again, it has now been developed and is almost unrecognizable to those people who actually lived there many years ago. So that is certainly one of the issues that we're still fighting in Sarasota. There's also a phenomenon in Sarasota that's occurring now in the city. It's sort of a reverse migration. African Americans in record numbers, I can't give you the numbers, but are actually moving back to the South for whatever reasons. In Sarasota, we have a phenomenon in which there are groups of African American retirees that are coming back to this area. Some are retiring in this area, but it's a real issue in Sarasota. They are retiring to the Lakewood Ranch area. They're coming from the Midwest. They're coming from the Northeast. They are actually becoming a presence in the city of Sarasota. And that's something that has been going on for years and years. It started early on. At one point, one of my theories was that there were a lot of retired Tuskegee Airmen. Tuskegee Airmen ground crews trained in Sarasota around World War II. And as they retired, many years later, many of them started to come into the Sarasota area. We had several Tuskegee Airmen who lived in the Sarasota area. And I think that may have been the origin. And they started bringing people down. So that phenomenon is going on still in Sarasota. It's very important that we have these types of conversations about race and inclusion. Many times I'm asked, this is such a difficult issue to talk about, right? Segregation, racism, and one of the things that I try to do, and I see it's happening here in Venice, is we try to lead these conversations about it. We have a series of conversations and a series of events that are going on to talk about the issues of race and inclusion. One of the things that I am trying to do is to get more people involved in the idea of inclusion. And that's a very, very difficult thing. We have a partnership with Booker High School because there are actually less African American lawyers in Sarasota than when I practiced 20 years ago, believe it or not. We actually have one African American who's a partner in a major law firm in Sarasota. Only one. When I first started practicing law, we had about 3 or 4. We only have one now. So things are actually regressive in that field. And so we're trying to incorporate getting more and more people interested in the law. And that's one of the partnerships that we have with Booker High School because they have a law academy. And Booker High School has a high percentage of African American students and minority students. We're trying to improve those numbers. So we're trying to do things about that. We also are trying to redevelop the Newtown area. I don't know how many people have been to the core Newtown area in Sarasota, going down Martin Luther King Boulevard. But there is a certain amount of redevelopment that's going on. If you go down to that core area, you will notice that there's an expansion of Ringling College of Art and Design. Down Martin Luther King, they have a huge sound stage. Again, the fear of gentrification is driving the community to try to enter a dialogue with Ringgold to prevent what happened in the Newtown community, to prevent the same thing that happened in Overtown, which is now Roseland. So there's a partnership between Ringgold College and the Newtown community to help culturally develop that center of town. We are talking about developing a cultural center there where we hope to have a museum at some point that celebrates the African American history of Newtown. But there's tension, and that tension is based on the history that has occurred in the past when African Americans who lived in that Overtown area were driven out by the white community into the town. So there's still some bad feelings there. But we're hopeful that we will be able to, instead of have gentrification, have cooperation and redevelop that area. So local businesses are partnering with the African American community. There's a restaurant that hopefully is going to be built there. We're talking about opening up some businesses. There's a medical center that's been there. We're talking about having a bank there, basically to revitalize that core. Yet and still we do have issues. Again, just common issues. Jeff talked about the fact that there are very few black waiters. If you go to a restaurant in Sarasota, it's a rare opportunity that you have an African American waiter in one of the upscale restaurants in Sarasota, and that's an issue that we're still dealing with and grappling with. And hopefully we'll have some improvement. Am I optimistic? Yes, I am. I'm optimistic because I know that things are getting better because I can actually see visual evidence of it. There are more and more African Americans that are taking part in the downtown core of Sarasota. We actually have, if you haven't heard of West Coast Black Theater Troupe, which is the largest African American theater troupe, probably south of New York City. It has invigorated the downtown core. They have a series of events in which they celebrate the African American experience. That has invigorated the community. We have a chapter of the Association of the Study of African American Life and History. That's called the SOLID. There are 300 members. It's a group that is dedicated to the study and preservation of African American life and history. We also have a very, very active political core now of young people who are getting more and more active in government. We have had several mayors who are African American descent. We have 2 African Americans on our city council. However, we have none on our county commission. We have none on our school board. And we are still hoping at some point we will have a little bit more representation on some of the local citizen, county, and city boards. So politically, we are not where we want to be. And we're working at it at a rate that hopefully will show some improvement soon, but we do have a long way to go. So from my perspective, it's gotten better. It needs to get better. We're doing everything we can. I still think that the vestiges of segregation have prevented a meaningful engagement by the black community in Sarasota. And hopefully that will change. But in my opinion, we still have ways and ways to go. But I do appreciate the opportunity of having these types of dialogues, which at least gets these issues out, and hopefully we can come up with some meaningful change. So I do know that we wanted to open things up to some questions, so do you want Jeff and I to come up for questions? Many of the things that I've said about historical events, Jeff can fact check me on them. And certainly the issue, I'm going to ask Jeff a question. He showed you a photograph of the African American Service Club.
Right.
And my understanding was that was built by the city because they did not want the African American soldiers that were training to have the problem of going into the white service club. So the city actually built that. So is that
Well,
that position?
I think the city built it, but I don't think it was for the exact reason that you said, about they're worried about them coming in, because everything was segregated anyway, and there wouldn't have been much chance of them going down to the municipal auditorium where it was.
Right.
You know, so I think the city built it. A guy named Albert Moore Sachs, who was an architect here, designed it. So that's what I know about the Army-Navy Club there.
The other issue, there was a photograph of the pool that was built. It was my understanding, again, you can correct me, that the city thought that this would appease the African-American community if they built the pool, and they would basically stop trying to integrate the beaches, but that did not happen.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
But they did get their pool, which was
better than nothing, I guess.
One of the things, before we get to questions, I always want to tell people that Florida had a very significant civil rights movement. You know, when you think of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 50s, you think about Birmingham, you think about Selma, you think about Greensboro. But we had a very, very active civil rights movement here in Florida that does not get enough credit. Many times you have seen those pictures of the integration of the St. Augustine beaches.
Yeah.
Dr. King came to St. Augustine. You saw that very famous photograph of when someone tried to integrate a pool and the owner of the motel was pouring muriatic acid in the pool. Dr. King considers St. Augustine one of his losses because they left St. Augustine without having a victory. There was also a bus boycott in Tallahassee that was going on pretty much the same time that the bus boycotts were going on in Montgomery. However, you know, you don't hear about that much. But the beach caravans in Sarasota were as integral a part of the civil rights movement as anything that was going on in Selma and Montgomery. And eventually they were able to integrate those beaches. But those beach caravans were led by ordinary African-American citizens from the Newtown community who would get in their cars and drive out to those beaches to force the integration of those beaches. So we had a lot of civil rights heroes here in Sarasota County. And the same things that were happening in Manatee County and Pinellas County where I was growing up. But you don't read about those. But simultaneously with what you were seeing in Selma and Birmingham was happening right here.
I don't know if you're aware that in Sarasota there is something called a hub zone, historically underutilized business area. And from Main Street of Sarasota, north 40 blocks, contains that zone. Any business that locates there has a priority in federal procurement. And that's a major edge, but no business is located up there, and there's been no move by the city to take advantage of that move. And I know that there's at least a 10-acre site that has a contamination they've cleaned up, would be perfect for bringing in a clean, modern industry. The requirement for that industry to qualify there for this hub zone is that they have to hire 35% of their employees from the zone itself. So it's a major opportunity that the city has let slide.
Yes, I agree with that, and I'm aware of that.
Can you tell us about your experiences in working with embracing the differences?
Okay, the question was, can I tell him a little bit, I'll tell you a little bit about my work with Embracing Our Differences. How many, by show of hands, how many people have heard of the Embracing Our Differences? Embracing Our Differences is basically an organization that was established to facilitate an understanding of diversity and inclusiveness, basically among students. If you go to Bayfront Park in Sarasota, you will see a display of art that celebrates issues of diversity and inclusion. What they also do is that they educate teachers on the issue of diversity and inclusion. They also transport students to see exhibits and have lectures about diversity and inclusion. Their philosophy is if we can ingrain the idea of embracing our differences at an early age, as people age, we won't have the issues that we're having today. So that's basically what we do. We work with students to empower them to understand that being different is okay, and not only is it okay, it's actually beneficial to us as a society. So that's what we do in a nutshell.
I wanted to ask you fellows about the concept of separation. You
compared to segregation. And it appears as though after the Civil War, the black churches decided to develop separate from trying to integrate the white mainline churches. So that kind of separation seemed to be very successful. And it appears that as we move into the 20th century, some of that sense of pride in separation continues. And it shows up, as we illustrated, in the various differences of opinion in the black community of Bolden and Newtown. Those who wanted to be assertive, integrationist, militant if necessary. The question is, it appears as though there's still a separationist group in the black community and an integrationist group in the black community. Is that seen as an impediment to ultimate full-fledged integration?
Well, I think I'll let the judge answer most of that, but the first part of that, when you were saying that early on they wanted to keep their own religious institutions among themselves, I would say they didn't have much of a choice. You know, they were not welcome. I don't know if they would have been barred from St. Martha's Church, but I never saw a black person in St. Martha's Church when I was a kid. So I don't think there was any much choice for them. If they wanted to practice their religion, they would have to practice it in their own churches. Now today,
well, you know, and of course, one of the most famous Martin Luther King quotes is the most segregated time of America was usually 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, which is probably still evident today. I think a part of your question dealt with a segregated community. Let me make this clear. Newtown is not a segregated community. Newtown is an African-American community that lies pretty much within the heart of Sarasota. It is a place where historically African-Americans were delegated. That's the only place that they could live. But the segregation was not a self-segregation on the African-Americans from Newtown. The city of Sarasota, the people of Sarasota who developed it, put those people in that position. Generations of them still live there. It's not a segregation that they put on themselves, it's a segregation that society made. So in that respect, I wouldn't say it's segregated. I would say that they are in a place that they were allocated many years ago, and the vestiges of that segregation and that racism still exist, and that's why we have not only the Newtown community, but those types of communities all over America.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me now?
they can't.
That one doesn't work.
Well, we'll say repeat the question.
Can I hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to speak to the situation.
Okay.
I'm going to speak to the situation here in Venice. We do have a community here in Venice. It's located out on the northeast section around Laurel Road. It's a viable community. The problem of integrating that group into the city functions is mainly coming down to problems with transportation. The boys and girls cannot come into the town to work, and they need help in that regard. Philosophical discussions are fine, but getting down to where the road meets the road, or transportation, and those kinds of issues need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you speak to the issue of real estate policies and the vestiges of separation, which I think are clearly a fundamental piece of our problem?
Well, My feeling about Newtown, I have ambivalent feelings about Newtown, is the comfort zone for the black community, because they're certainly not wholesale welcomed in the white community. And I think that the double-edged sword of it, they just stayed there, you know, because that's where their comfort level is. Like my grandparents were Lebanese, and they had a Lebanese community, and that's where they stayed. So that's the double-edged sword of Newtown, because I think it has prevented them, now that they can, ostensibly, move into other areas. But then the other areas that they can move into are so expensive, how are they going to get there? They can't afford to get there.
And you know, when you talk about real estate, and you talk about the greatest gift that generations give to each other is real estate and home ownership. And you talk about, if you really want to go to the root of the problem, I mean, we could actually go to the root of the problem and say it's slavery, but if you want to go to a more immediate root of the problem, it's the fact that for many years African Americans were denied equal access to home loans. We know that. We know from actual documents that there was redlining going on, that African Americans could not purchase homes in certain areas. And we do know that the greatest gift that generations give each other are the equity in the homes. So that did not occur for a generation, several generations of African Americans. And so you're sort of relegated to where you live a lot of times based on what was given to you. And so the vestiges of racism, the vestiges of Plessy versus Ferguson, still has affected the African American in terms of where we can live today, because we just certainly don't have that buying power that white Americans have, because they did not have to live with redlining. They could buy in communities where the equity of their houses enabled them to pass that wealth on to their generations, subsequent generations.
Thank you both for a very challenging evening. Judge Williams, you mentioned this about the lack of representation on all sorts of government boards and bodies and committees and such. I wonder if you could look into the future and imagine what the impact of the passage of Amendment 4 is going to be on that.
Well, you know, one of the proudest things that I mean, you know, I'm not going to get political. Remember, judges are neutral. We can't get overly political. But the passage of Amendment 4 was significant for a variety of reasons. Number one, we were one of the few states that did not automatically restore rights to people who had served their time. It disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of voters, black and white, because of mistakes that they had made. I think it's going to have a significant impact. I'm very proud of our local supervisors of elections who have allowed the restoration to be self-implemented. You don't have to do anything except register the vote. I know that there was a lot of concern about whether or not the legislature was going to put some hoops in front of people who wanted to register the vote, but so far, Governor DeSantis and other members of the legislature have indicated, nope, the will of the people say that if you've served your time and you don't owe anything to the Department of Corrections, you're good to vote. So I think that'll have a significant impact on the next election, certainly.
Two things. You mentioned the gentrification problem, and as you know, it's really countrywide. I wonder if you have some solutions for it. Because, I mean, the problem seems to be people with money can buy where they want to buy, and that changes the whole economy and situation, driving out people who can. I don't know what the solutions are. You mentioned one thing, try to strengthen the communities as they exist, but I wonder if there's some other ideas about how, on a national basis or here or there, how to fix that problem.
You know, the Newtown community, and growing up in the South, I'm a witness to this. Traditionally, African American communities were located in the least desirable sections of cities. And that was pretty much true for most African American communities. Newtown was kind of unique because it's actually in the city of Sarasota. It's within the core of the city of Sarasota. And if you drive to Sarasota, if you have the opportunity to drive to Sarasota, and you go to what is now known as the Rosemary District, you're pretty much in Newtown. If you go up to where Ringling College is, you will see that Ringling College is expanding its campus. New College of Florida is expanding its campus. So if the African American homeowners who own homes, and a big percentage of them actually do own homes in the Newtown area, if they can hang on to those homes, and if the city makes good on its promise to basically build up that area and bring businesses to that area, they are going to reap the benefits that white America's been reaping for years and years. So it won't be gentrification. It really will be what it was supposed to be, which was a urban renewal.
Yes, I'd like to recommend to everybody a book that is titled The Color of Law. And it has a tremendous amount of information in it about how segregation is legalized in this country by not just local governments, but by the federal government. I'm sorry that I can't offhand remember the name of the author, but it's called The Color of Law. And we read it, I remember the retired attorneys association of Sarasota. And one of the things that I discovered when I read the book is that African American veterans were not entitled to loans, both educational and mortgages, that all other veterans were entitled to after World War II. Which I was horrified when I read that.
Right.
But it's a fact, and it was the federal government that legitimized this.
Right, the federal government and the banks who would not loan those veterans monies to build homes in certain
Right,
areas.
right. And I also like to plug the League of Women Voters, who was very instrumental in Amendment 4. And except for my bad knees, I was on the hook to be a mentor at Booker Law.
Oh, great. Well, hope you get to do that.
Yes, a question for Judge Williams that has to do with, I think the author's name is Michelle Alexander,
Yes.
who wrote the book, The Mass Incarceration of Blacks, The New Jim Crow. And her theory is that the high preponderance of young blacks in the prisons is the new Jim Crow. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. In fact, criminal justice reform, weirdly enough, one of the few things that I actually kind of agree with what's happening with the Trump administration. And that's not a political statement. It's not a political statement. There is an emphasis on criminal justice reform. When you can have groups as disinterested in each other normally, like the Koch brothers and the ACLU actually uniting for criminal justice reform, it must be something there. Florida is also emphasizing criminal justice reform. I think everybody now recognizes that our prison system basically is a broken system, that incarcerating people for drug crimes and certain crimes is not working. So I'm very optimistic. If you want to be optimistic, you can be optimistic about what the Florida legislature and what we're doing nationally in terms of criminal justice reform. We're even taking steps locally to make certain that people who are incarcerated are people that need to be here. We are emphasizing not incarcerating people for homeless, victimless crimes. We do understand the difference between people who are addicted to drugs and people who sell drugs for a living. We do understand the difference between people who are arrested for crimes basically because they're homeless. And so I am very, very, very enthusiastic about what the country is doing as a whole, and specifically what we're doing as a state on criminal justice reform. It's the #1 issue on this state's legislative docket. So stay tuned for that. So we're very happy with that.
I have 2 nieces and a nephew who are biracial, and my nephew, since the age of 16, has always had a job after school. And when he got into college, he developed a business cleaning offices. And he continued that after he got a job at the bank. He did that in the evening. One evening he was coming home from doing one of his jobs, and he got pulled over. And he was asked to step out of the car, and he did. And he asked the officer why he had stopped him. And the officer responded with a punch. And just punched him, and he fell to the ground.
I will respond in this respect that implicit bias training is now the norm for law enforcement training now, based on what has happened, obviously. And certainly, you know, we have certain issues in terms of who actually is screening people to become police officers. I can only be hopeful that they're doing their job in that respect. But in the end, one of the things that I talk to African American young people, especially African American young males, is the most dangerous time in your life will be when you see those lights come on behind you and pull over. And how important it is for you to put your ego in check to make certain that you survive the encounter. And we lecture to students in Sarasota County. I know that I do it personally, and the title of the lecture is Surviving the Encounter. So we have to, on our own, teach our children how to survive. And then we'll get to the next stage in terms of training and screening provides. But right now, what we're doing, and I can say we in terms of a collective group of people that I've worked with, is we are training young people, especially young African American males, how to survive a police encounter. I think this
I don't think anyone can hear me.
Sure.
My question was just when you mentioned, for example, gentrification in Newtown, and that hopefully as the houses expand, that their current residents or African American will keep their homes and then schools and businesses. My question is, how do those negotiations take place? What is the process for that?
The question, I don't know if you heard it, but basically to ensure that the homeowners in the Newtown area are a part of the growth of that area and don't become victims of gentrification. I probably pushed that a little bit, but that's the idea. We feel that the number one thing that we can tell the homeowners and the people who live in the Newtown community is to educate them on what is going on. So the progress, and we have started sort of grassroots committees getting the people in the Newtown community to understand what's happening in their community, is to educate them on what is going to happen. Educate them on letting them understand that they have to project what's happening 10, 20, 30 years in the future. Many of the people who have homes, that had homes, sold their homes, not knowing what was going to happen to that neighborhood. If you go down to the Greenwood College and you look at their soundstage, which is a huge facility, people sold those homes years in advance. So we're trying to educate the community, and there, like I said, there's a lot of people who own their own homes there of what's coming, and not to sell their homes, to hang on to them, so that they can be a part of this process. I will say the city of Sarasota is very, very proactive in getting that information out. So all a part of this whole process is educating people who actually have a vested interest in that community, especially the homeowners.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm not going to pretend that this might work. I'm an African American from here in Venice. We've not met.
We have not met, and I apologize to the African Americans in Venice. I do, because I do not get to Venice enough. I grew up in St. Pete. I worked most of my career in Bradenton, and I'm stationed in Sarasota. And I apologize for not getting down here, getting to know the African American community in Venice. That being said,
that's fine. That's okay. Before I say what I got to say, I ask one question. How many folks in this room are originally from Florida? Raise your hand. My point I want to make is I'm from the all-American city of East St. Louis. You know all-American city, okay? The African-American experience, as I said, and hear us talking, we speak as if it's a us and them. The African-American experience is all of our experiences. Yes. Either directly or indirectly, we have been involved and engaged in it. Either you benefited from it, or you were victimized by it. But it's all of our shared experience. And I think one of the things that East St. Louis has done in the past 2 or 3 years, and those of you who don't know what East St. Louis about East St. Louis? You've heard about Chicago. Chicago is a panacea compared to what East St. Louis is. Okay. East St. Louis is a community that was an all-American city that was predominantly white. The whites moved out of East St. Louis and it became an impoverished city. It has one of the highest crime rates and highest unemployment rates in the country. About 3 years ago, a rebranding effort was started. And I've got an extra one of these, I'll give it to you. You can have this. This is a book called I Am East St. Louis. Let me give this to you. And it's a rebranding effort, and that part of the African American experience is, in order to make change happen, you have to understand what is happening. And what's happening in East St. Louis is people outside of the community are defining what that community was. If you say East St. Louis, they say it's crime, it's black, don't stop there, don't go there, don't shop there. There's a transportation system that's set up that the bi-state bus system goes from Belleville to St. Louis without stopping in East St. Louis. Transportation ain't problem. It's perception, it's your paradigm. Okay? So as we look for solutions, understand how you see the problem, how you define the problem, how you see the people in the community. When is the last time you saw somebody and became a mentor to a young black person? When have you done that? When did we do that? You know? So those are things that I just want to share. It's not us and them. It's all about it. It's all of us. And we have to be involved in the solution. Anybody know Jimmy Connors? Yeah. Next time, ask him why he says he's from Belleville and not East St. Louis.
If I could make one comment on what you just said, that is true. Perception is a reality for many people. The Newtown community basically demanded that the Sarasota Herald Tribune, when they reported crime that occurred in what they call the Newtown community, not refer to it as Newtown. It was Sarasota. And so that took a grassroots effort because people realized that crime was occurring all over Sarasota. Why did you have to say that this occurred in Newtown? So that is so we realize that that is the perception.
The gentleman at the mic has the last question.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
They asked if the African American lived in Venice. I actually was born in Venice. Here, I was born in 1958, and I lived here most of my life. But in Sarasota, actually 20-some years. But I was born and raised with the Venice. I went to no Collins Elementary and those kind of things. And I learned, and I really love this setting. It's one thing I learned. I went to all-white school all my life. So one thing I learned in those early years, I didn't do so good in school. And why I say I like this setting is because as I thought about my childhood, you know, it was really rough. It was rough. And I thought about it as I got older, and I said to myself, the reason we have this problem is because we don't understand each other. So that's why I really like this setting. And I'm also a pastor in Laurel. I actually live in Northport now, and it's sort of because of affordability and availability. But I lived in Sarasota over 20 years. I have 8 children. Some of them went to Booker. My youngest back there is my 7th, 8th child. And he went to L.E. Booker. And so we moved to Northport, so he goes to school there now. But I think this is very awesome because just from my childhood, you know, the situation that we had, I would say, wow, when I look back on it, they didn't understand me and I didn't understand them. And one thing you said earlier about the economic part of it, a lot of times I talk to whites and they will say, some people say, well, I started from nothing and everybody else out there started from nothing. Well, I've had some experiences where I go to get a job here in Venice, you know, none of experience, no. And I started out in air conditioning after I was also a veteran. So I come back and I started out in air conditioning. Well, some of those same white gentlemen was in my class at what we call Tech then, got jobs and they didn't have no experience. Right. So I tell people, you don't understand. So that's why I say if we can understand, you'll know why we're up here and some are down here, because you never got the opportunity to equal out. Right? But in doing so, we persevered, and I thank God for my era because I have awesome friends here in Venice that I went to school with, and we are awesome friends, and we know that if you get to understand one another, awesome. So as you say about our country, if we just get the opportunity to learn one another, be different, different culture. I say this in my conversations all the time, that we are different, but we have to embrace our differences and learn each other. And I found out that also help us in our country, in our city as well. And I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna preach it to y'all. But I'm also with something you might be familiar with, One Christ, One City. And we do a lot together in the churches. I heard you talk about the churches coming together. Well, the churches work together, and we try to show the inclusion throughout the city of Venice, Longport, and Laura, Oklahoma. So we're trying to get there.
The last question, and one of the things that I feel, that's why I'm a big admirer of Mr. LaHurd. I really think history is so important. Because if you don't understand history and you don't understand the contributions that all people made towards making not only this area but our country great, then you do look at people differently. And I'll just give you just one small example. You saw the service club photo that Mr. LaHurd showed. We had a whole program once at Booker High School talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. And if you don't know about who the Tuskegee Airmen are, you should. They were an African-American fighter escort group that never lost a bomber in World War II. So we taught them about the local history, about how some of the Tuskegee Airmen ground crew trained in the Sarasota area, and about how some of the Tuskegee Airmen came back here and retired. But there were a group of people, black and white, that did not know that African Americans participated in World War II. And not only were they astounded about that, when we told them they were actual fighting pilots, they were astounded. And so those white students who never knew that history, and those black students who never knew that history, I think now have a better understanding of what everyone did to sacrifice. I mean, when you think about African American soldiers in World War, they fought in every war and were not themselves free, but contributed to the freedom of this country. I think you have a special understanding about people. And that's why I think history is so important. I think it's very important to understand how everyone contributed to this area. And that's why what Mr. LaHurd does is so important. And it's so important for people to understand the contributions of everyone, black and white, towards our development. We're so divisive in this country right now. But every single person that has come to this country, every group that has come to this country has made this country great. And I do think it's a great country. I do think it needs a lot of work. But the work really is looking back to see what made us great and not dividing us. And so that's my political statement. And I really had a good evening. I
hope you all learned something from this.
I've had this thought in my head for a long time, but I didn't know if it was valid, and the judge could help me. I think the city and the county of Sarasota should each write a letter of apology to the black community for how they were treated.